Hi everybody, I'm Miles the Sound Guy. Thank you so much for tuning into my channel. On this channel I'll be telling you about some tips and tricks about how to make your audio productions sound great. Today I'm going to be talking about Windows and Mac and the pros and cons of each of which operating system you should use for your post-production needs. Stay tuned. Mac OS was well ahead of its time, starting in the late 90s when consumers started buying personal computers to doing work and buying things online. Today things have changed. A poll from 2018 from Avid showed that consumers were willing to transition over to Windows 10 computers at about 50%. Today, Apple mainly invests in its iPhone devices, so people are more likely to go to Windows 10 because the cost is a lot lower and Windows operating software is able to support a lot of usable programs that people can use for just about anything. One of the reasons people are still using Mac computers is because the older versions were still quite reliable. Especially computers from 2008 all the way up to 2013 were computers that you could upgrade over time and they would just work. I would note, Mac computers did use FireWire, so many of the FireWire devices you may be using for post-production are compatible with the older Mac computers, whereas Windows didn't really have them on many of their computers or laptops, giving that an advantage. However, since USB 3.0 is the most cost-effective standard, it is equally accessible for both your Mac and PC. When you're doing post-production, what matters is how much CPU and cores you have, whether you're using solid-state drive or a hard drive, and what type of motherboard you have. If you're using virtual instruments, then a higher speed processor would probably be your best bet. If you need a lot of plugins and require it to be used at the same time, then more cores would handle just fine. I recommend anybody that is booting up their computer to install their operating software on a solid-state drive. It's fast, it has no moving parts, and it's able to get the job done quickly and reliably. I do recommend, however, that you put any sort of files, such as video or audio, for safekeeping on a hard disk drive, and you can get them at an inexpensive price, both internal and external hard disk drives. When you buy a computer, be sure to find out what type of motherboard it is and look at reviews on how well that motherboard does over time. The motherboard encompasses all of the components of your computer so that it could function well. If it's a great motherboard, it'll work well. If it's not, it will have difficulty performing its duties. One thing you could do is you could disable power management such as Intel's step speed, so that way you can have your processors running at full power. Don't overload it with tons of programs if it cannot handle it. And that's why it's important to getting RAM. It's important to get the proper amount of RAM so that way your computer can handle all of your post-production needs. I would recommend anywhere between 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes if you have to run more than a few programs at a time. Another thing to keep in mind is latency. Latency is the time that it takes for audio to go into a microphone or a preamp and come out of your speakers, so that way you can hear it. What happens is it goes through an audio interface device, through its input and output. It goes through your computer to get processed through your plugins, and then comes out of your computer and then back through your audio interface device. In order to reduce latency, disable any application or service that you do not need running on your computer. Don't use plugins when you're recording, so that way it doesn't slow down your performance. If you have any wireless or Bluetooth in the BIOS on, disable it. Another thing to note is your buffer size in your DAW. The larger your buffer size, the more reliable recording and playback, but the greater latency. The smaller buffering, you get less latency, but potentially more risks for things like audio glitches and pop sounds throughout your performance. It's recommended that around 64 to 128 samples are ideal to start a project, but set this to work best with the computer you have. Choosing Windows or Mac operating software will work well for your post-production needs because the hardware they use is basically the same. With that being said, this is Miles the Sound Guy, and I'll see you on the next one.